Sheck Exley and Jim Bowden spent a year of intense training before their planned dive at Zacaton Cenote in Mexico. This was to prepare them for the severe environment they would confront on their descent into the 80-foot deep water-filled pit, a depth never before achieved during a single dive. The two were upbeat and eager about the project. They were convinced they could complete the dive. After all, being prepared is half the battle. Unfortunately, in difficult cave diving, preparation is seldom sufficient. The deeper water's severe circumstances were too harsh and punishing, that even minor mistakes could offer the biggest risk. Bowden and Exley would find out the hard way when the smallest error during their dive culminated in a horrific disaster. Hundreds of dives over the next 3 years would gradually disclose Zacaton's immense dimensions, but it wasn't until April 1993 when Sheck Exley, the most recognized cave diver at the time, joined Bowden's crew, that they discovered how deep the sinkhole is. Bowden and Exley air dived to heights of 250 and 407 feet, respectively. These were much deeper than the previously explored depth of 250 feet, so the team returned to try a more accurate plumb line. They watched as the line spun off the reel and were astounded when the weight only stopped after 1080 feet. Bowden plunged 504 feet the next day with mixed gases, while Exley dove 721. Neither performance nor physiological issues were encountered during or after the dive. These fueled the two's ambition. If they could drop even further, they could attempt to set a new world record. Bowden and Exley reached an agreement. They would return to Zacaton within a year to obtain the bottom of the Cenote. Over the next year, the two completed a series of increasingly deeper dives in preparation for the 1,100-foot attempt. Bowden and his crew traveled to Mexico 6 times to investigate sinkholes. Meanwhile, Exley traveled to explore the massive underwater cave at Bushman's Hall, South Africa, where he suffered visual, somatic, and neurological symptoms of high-pressure nerve sickness 863 feet deep in the system. Fortunately, his problems subsided immediately after his first decompression stop at 400 feet. There were no long-term consequences, but the episode accurately demonstrated how deadly a deeper dive would be. Finally, their preparations were completed, and Exley and Mary Ellen Eckhoff met with Bowden's team at Rancho Azufrosa in April 1994. Their diving location, of course, was the Zacaton, which appeared to have the ideal conditions for an open-circuit dive to 1,000 feet and beyond. The Cenote was easily accessible, with warm water and no discernible current. The first 2 days were spent in Zacaton and El Misionamiento, setting the requisite decompression bottles at their predetermined depths. The bottles were positioned in 2 separate line sets a few meters apart, allowing Exley and Bowden to dive freely without any contact or any interference. Their initial drop into the sinkhole would be swift, a quick in and a slow out to reduce gas accumulation in their body and minimize dangerous bends, which are extremely painful and often fatal. On the morning of April 6, 1994, the team finally gathered on the banks of El Misionamiento, preparing for their much-anticipated dive. Bowden and Exley suited up and swam through the 600-foot El Passage passage and into Zacaton, while the support team stayed behind to monitor the divers' conditions and provide aid as needed. The two crossed their respective lines about 9:50 a.m. Central Standard Time. They exchanged affirmative nods before began their descent. They had not seen each other since. Bowden planned a 100-foot-per-minute descent to 300 feet on air, followed by a 600-foot descent on hilly air before switching to his bottom mix. He would then slow down about 750 to 800 feet, where he had previously noted the onset of high-pressure nervous syndrome, HPNS. Everything worked as planned, and he was able to travel 800 feet with scarcely a tremor. However, when Bowden reached 900 feet, he discovered that he had taken in more air than he had anticipated. His bottom mix cylinders had hardly more than 1,000 psi. If the pressure dropped below 500 psi, his regulator could fail, which would be extremely dangerous for him. Bowden chose to ascend. He filled his buoyancy control device and came to a stop at 925 feet. He exchanged tanks and gradually climbed to 450 feet. Afterwards, he arrived at his first deco stop, but he wasn't safe. The regulator on his deco bottle flowed furiously the soon he turned it on. He just had 8 minutes before his next stop, and he was quickly running out of oxygen. Exley was also in danger a few meters away. But unlike Bowden, he had realized too late that he was running out of gas. He didn't have enough air to inflate his buoyancy device, so he wrapped himself in his line to quickly come to a stop. His maximum depth was just 906, therefore he ended up higher than Bowden. However, without the assistance of buoyancy, he would be unable to ascend. He was losing ground fast. Support divers Ann Kristovich and Bowden's wife, Karen Hall, waited nervously hundreds of feet above them. They followed the two men's bubble path. Bowden's bubbles vanished first, followed by Exley's a few seconds later, suggesting that the two had crossed the ledge at 250 feet. One set of bubbles resurfaced a quarter-hour later. They knew one of the divers had begun his ascent, but they couldn't figure out which one. Chris followed their original plan and descended to meet Bowden at the 47-minute mark of the dive, and the two women exchanged anxious glances. At the same moment, Mary Ellen Eckhoff arrived at the surface, aware of the situation but unconcerned. She snatched up an extra deco bottle and dashed over to Exley. Bowden was able to solve the problem with his deco bottle. Although he was unable to repair the regulator, he discovered that he could open and close the valve after each breath. It was exhausting labor, and because of the lost air, he had to cut his decompression short. He had a much easier experience in the beginning on his second deco stop, where he had to stay for a lengthier decompression. He could finally rest after his third halt at 130 feet. He looked around and discovered that the stage bottles on Exley's lines were neatly packed and unopened. He had a sinking feeling, but he was convinced that Exley had gone deeper and was still at the lower deco stop. This assurance was unfounded. Bowden had been Exley's diving buddy on numerous occasions, and Exley had always been able to dive deeper than him. Eckhoff felt the same way, and it helped to keep her fears at bay. Exley was a known cave diver at the time. He was the Michael Jordan of cave diving, so he had to surface. On her way down, though, she only ran into Kristovich and Bowden, who had recently met. She scribbled quickly on her slate that she was heading to 250 to look for bubbles. She jumped from the cliff, but there was no trace of Exley. She could only discover 2 laminated pages of his diving profile, which he would never part with while still alive. Her darkest worries had come true, she realized. Exley was no longer there. Eckhoff swam up despite her tears. She wanted to get to the surface, but Hole stopped her at 100 feet. Eckhoff's gauge read 278 feet, so Hole could only hold and soothe her while she waited more than 30 minutes to decompress. There were press people waiting above the sinkhole to write about the world record dive. They never expected to be writing about the death of a legend. Bowden ultimately learned what had happened from Hole on his final deco stop. His mind went blank, and he couldn't get his head around the reality that Exley was no longer there. When he considered the man's accomplishments, it seemed inconceivable. Exley had made over 4,000 dives and conquered over 1,000 caves, but now he's gone. Bowden spent the next few hours of his decompression with this dreadful knowledge. He finally emerged in the middle of the night, but he was suffering from his second episode of Ben's Kristovich. He was given enormous doses of intravenous steroids, anticoagulants, and painkillers in a controversial French method that proved beneficial in the first case. Bowden was back on his feet the next morning. Many feared Exley's body would never be found, but when the dive team brought up Exley's unused decompression tanks, 3 days later, they discovered his body entangled in the guideline. The precise reason of his death would be unknown, and the autopsy would be inconclusive. In the years that followed, there was little mention of Exley's death, although his life and accomplishments were constantly remembered. Bowden also holds the record for the deepest open cave dive in Zacaton at 925 feet. We'd like to thank everyone who has followed this tale up to this point. If you enjoyed this article, please press the like button and leave a comment below. Please click the subscribe button and turn on your notification bell to be notified when a new video is posted if you want to see more of this type of content. Be cautious till the next time, and never lose your sense of amazement.